We are Pro Cannabis Media.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Cannabis Chat for a Monday afternoon. We call this cannabinoid, or actually we call it Medicinal Mondays. I'm Jimmy Young, the founder of Pro Cannabis Media, and I'm joined on Mondays by Alyssa Merrill from Flower and Tonic. And more importantly now, we are joined by Dr. Peter Grinspoon. And this is such an honor to be talking with you, Peter, because I've heard so much about you and followed your family for years. To actually have an opportunity to say hello is fun for me. And I appreciate you taking the time to join me and Alyssa today.
Thanks for inviting me on.
So you're quite the story. A primary care physician at MGH. Just to start, you're an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School and now a certified health and wellness coach. I'm going to throw out a quick softball to you about that health and wellness coaching thing. How do you go about doing that, and what is your goal for that?
Well, health and wellness coaching is just a very positive thing. It's about helping people find their own pathway to solving, the problems in their lives. My hospital trained a couple of us to become health and wellness coaches to help physicians with burnout, because physicians are really struggling. They did that before COVID. But now, needless to say, we're needed more than ever. People are really struggling. Physicians are, I'm happy to coach physicians or non-physicians. I just happen to have a pretty deep background in physician health because I work in for the physician health service for 2 years. So I have a broad background in physician health. But coaching is just such a positive thing. I really love it. It really, you could just help people with anything. And it's just a very collaborative process. It's the opposite of like you tell someone lose weight. It's more like helping people define their goals and what's important to them. And then they figure out with you how to get there. And it's really successful and really positive.
Yeah, I too work with a coach, so I certainly recognize that. And there was a time for 35 years I was coaching on the sidelines of many soccer teams all over New England, but that's a different type of coach. One of the things that obviously we have to talk about the pandemic that's going on right now. You talk about the stress for doctors and frontline workers. It is remarkable to me where we're at, and now we're going through what is anticipated to be the third wave of this pandemic. Do you see any light on the horizon? Is there hope for us? How are we ever going to get back to some state of normalcy, or will we ever?
Well, I see hope in just like the dedication and of my colleagues, and just how self-sacrificing they are and how generous and willing they are to kind of band together. I mean, my hospital did a phenomenal job. I work in an inner city clinic in Chelsea. We got slaughtered during the pandemic. We had the highest rate in the country for a week or two.
Right.
And everybody did a great job. So I have hope just by seeing how we respond to the pandemic. Not talking about like obviously the president, but talking about like the doctors and so forth. But I think it's going to be, honestly, to be straightforward and honest, I think it's going to be a pretty rough winter. And then I think, sometime in the spring or the summer, we'll have a vaccine and things will start to get better. But I think we just have to kind of do our best to support each other and, really look out for people. I think the people who are living alone are the people who are going to have the roughest time. If you have a spouse or family or a pet, it makes it a lot better. But those people who are living alone are really going to have a tough time this winter. So it's really important to reach out to people, to call people, to connect with them, and to make sure that people aren't just like suffering in silence.
Right. Absolutely not. Alyssa, I know you have a question for Peter.
No, I'll ding dong ditch at least one of my kids at someone's house any day. But I had the pleasure of meeting you 20 years ago. I was looking back and it was right around 9/11. And I was a pharmaceutical rep, and, I sold Ritalin, and then, it was during the time when Viagra was launched. There were a lot of big drugs, and I saw, there's a lot of physician use of Ritalin. A lot of physicians we got it for, they would, and a lot of sales reps have ADD, truly do. So they would be prescribed and we would share with doctors. There was a lot of pill popping, not going to lie. And I felt fortunate. I never really liked them enough to pursue it, but I think it's a huge problem. And I love what you're doing and sharing your story. And if you could just maybe touch upon a little more of you know, what you can offer for physicians who are struggling, because I just think there was a problem before. I can't imagine what they're going through right now. So
Right. Well, my story in a nutshell is that I'm 13 years now in recovery from opiate addiction. And the problem is it's such a taboo subject. Nobody talks about it. And so what I did, instead of like crawling under a rug like everybody else does, is I actually wrote a memoir about it. It's called Free Refills. I called it Free Refills because doctors, as you allude to, and nurses and other healthcare professionals have such access to medications. And then if you combine the access with the stress that we're under, it's just an epidemic of addiction. And, you know, the rate of addiction in the general population to drugs or alcohol is like 9%. And among healthcare professionals, we think it's like 10 to 15%, like much higher. But, you know, who knows? Because everybody's afraid to even talk about it. And the problem is when you try to get help, you get punished. You say, like, I'm struggling, and the medical board yanks your license away. Yep. So nobody gets help voluntarily. They don't get help. Like in my case, I didn't get help until the state police and the DEA visited me in my office for some bad prescriptions. And, you know, that's just no way to treat a really serious issue like that. I mean, people who are getting help and being monitored are safe. People who you don't know about or who are dangerous. So if we created a climate where people could actually voluntarily get help and feel comfortable and safe doing that, the patients would be safer, doctors, nurses would be safer. So that's part of why I wrote the book. And as you also mentioned, I'm really worried about, you know, doctors, nurses, frontline providers. You know, the stress is just so overwhelming. And people in general too. I mean, drug use and alcohol use is skyrocketing. I think a really important harm reduction would be if they were to use cannabis instead of alcohol or opiates would be great. I mean, you know, in a perfect world, all of us would meditate and relax and exercise and eat tofu, and we wouldn't need to rely on anything. And then if we used an intoxicant, you know, all societies have used intoxicants. We use it thoughtfully and for, you know, wellness purposes, not to rely on it. But in reality, in general, we have a really stressed out society, and now it's like a profoundly stressful time, and people are using things to rely on. And I do think it's a lot safer and healthier to use cannabis than alcohol or opiates. So, or Valium or benzodiazepines. So I think there is a really strong harm reduction argument in favor of cannabis. And I think states where you have recreational cannabis are going to do a lot better than states that don't.
Question for you regarding a word that I know is part of this whole research we're doing and dealing with intoxicants, vitamins, whole health medicine, integrative medicine, all this stuff. The difference between an addiction and a dependency, and where does moderation fit in there?
Right. Well, that's sort of a minefield with the terminology, but I mean, you know, the DSM-5, the psychiatrists came up with this really complicated definition of addiction, and if you fulfill 2 of the 13 characteristics, and they managed to rope in like most people who use medical cannabis, or a lot of people, as having cannabis use disorder. And the problem is that people who use the cannabis don't think they have a use disorder. You know, there's just a fundamental misunderstanding or difference of opinion about cannabis use, which I think needs to really be ironed out. But the way I look at addiction is a very simple definition, which is continued use despite negative consequences. If you're using it and it's screwing up your life, and then you know it's screwing up your life, but you still can't stop using it, then you're addicted. Dependence is more like, you know you're doing it, and you know it's bad for you, and you know you're relying on it, and it's just a crutch, like a really heavy crutch, which is just unhealthy, and you're aware of it, but it's not taking over everything like an addiction. So dependence is like a sort of a milder form of addiction that isn't like subsuming your whole life. Okay. But again, people have battled for decades over these definitions, and it's really contentious. And, it's just a work in progress.
So
go ahead.
I'm going to follow up on that with a heavy crutch is what you used. So how do you decide what is responsible use of cannabis? If you're using it every day, every night to help you go to sleep or to relax after a hard day's work or whatever it is to take the edge off, and you're using it, maybe 3 or 4 puffs a night or a couple of tinctures, whatever the macro dose is that you take, is there harm to that? And are you dependent on it? Or do you just like the product and you get benefits from it?
Well, you just asked like 4 different questions.
Thank
because,
you.
If you're, you could be dependent on it and it still could be helping you. Like, there are withdrawal symptoms when you stop cannabis. People get grumpy and have trouble sleeping and eating, but there are withdrawal symptoms from antidepressants or from anxiety medication.
Caffeine.
And from caffeine, absolutely.
Right.
Just because there are withdrawal symptoms and you're have physical dependence doesn't mean they're not helpful or good medications. Like, people get withdrawal symptoms from like Effexor, a really important antidepressant. And as you said, caffeine, like 80% of Americans drink caffeine and they don't have caffeine use disorder. So, but at the same time, it is a fine line for some people. I mean, again, I would say if you're having negative consequences, if you're smoking it every day and your asthma is getting worse and your doctor says you've got to stop smoking every day and then you can't stop smoking every day, that would be an indication that you're unhealthily dependent. For example, I have a patient that has been going to the emergency room like every month barfing. And we don't know if it's cyclic vomiting or cannabis hyperemesis. Right. The only way to find out is to stop smoking for 6 months. I'm like, look, dude, I'm a pro-cannabis doctor, but you have to stop for 6 months because you can't be going to the emergency room every once or twice a month, puking your brains out and like being on IV fluids for 2 days. You're absolutely miserable. It's awful. And, he was having trouble stopping. And that's like either a heavy dependency or an addiction. That's like continued use despite negative consequences. So I would say if there are negative consequences and you still can't, then it's obviously either a heavy dependency or an addiction. But if someone's like using it, moderately, there's no dose escalation, it's doing something important for them, it's helping them creatively or spiritually or with physical pain or with intimacy, and they're using it responsibly. They're vaping dry flower, which is ground up flower, which is the safest way to take it inhalationally. And there's no negative consequences, particularly if they're using it instead of other medications. Because I always like to ask, what else would you be using if you're not using cannabis? If they're using it for sleep, they'd be on Ambien or Trazodone. Those things are like much more dangerous than cannabis. Then I ask, like, what is the harm? I mean, there's no free lunch with any medication. So it's not, people pretend that cannabis doesn't have any side effects or any downside, but I think it's safer. It's all about relative risks.
Alyssa, go ahead. I bet you got another one.
I say because people, knowing I've been in this industry for a while, people ask me that question pretty often. And I usually say, like, I don't know if this is the right thing to say, I'll ask you, but I'm like, you should have like at least one drug buddy. Like, if you're starting this and if you're using this and you're wondering if it's too much, you need to have someone who you can be completely open and honest with. And if you find yourself lying, then like that's you're telling, that's usually
absolutely true. But as we beat down the stigma, hopefully people will be able to be open and honest with everybody, like with their doctor, with their families. It shouldn't be something people have to be secretive about.
How do we do that? Because I mean, it's the California, it's like not that, I mean, in California, it's just a different world. I mean, people have these little mints that they're popping and like weight loss, like, and why, like, we don't have the products that they have here, which is mind boggling. I mean, I know we're newer, in Massachusetts, it's newer, but I don't know. I still question so many things about this industry. Like, why don't we have a product that is for a cancer patient? You know what I mean? Like, it's killing me to this industry a little bit. So
you want the consistency? Is that what you're looking for, Alyssa? Is that?
I mean, people. Yes. I mean, yeah. Like the products aren't there. The consistency isn't there. The products aren't there. I mean, they're getting there, but they need help from someone like you. I don't think someone to just go to a recreational shop I think a lot of people, and I feel like you'd probably agree, this medical recreational, it's horrible because the majority of people who are going for recreational products are using them for medicinal use. They just don't have their card. So that's right. I mean, that's how you define it. That's how the everything's reported. I don't know, but I do find most people who are recreationally using it, it's for sleep. It's for those things. They just don't know.
Oh, they've studied that. Absolutely. A huge percent, something like 2/3 of recreational users were using it for sleep and pain.
Yeah.
But the uses are overlapping. I mean, it's not necessarily, I mean, cannabis does many things at once. So, a lot of these studies study one thing. Does it help with sleep, or does it help with pain, or does it help with anxiety? But cannabis helps with like all of those things. So the studies sometimes don't really capture what it does. I mean, it's not all or nothing. It can help you with anxiety, pain, sleep, and be recreational at the same time. It's sort of like not, it requires like a little bit more of a complex category, I think.
Yes.
Ibuprofen, I guess, is pain and inflammation. So that's two things. But it's just I absolutely agree with you, and I think it's a question of time. I mean, California's had it legal for longer than we have, at least medicinally.
Yeah.
And culturally, they've been, it's more of a sort of cannabis friendly culture out there. I mean, they have their conservatives too. But, I think we'll get there. I mean, think of where we are compared to like Oklahoma. I mean, it's a whole gradation. You have to keep it in perspective. So, we'll get there.
I think the doctors in Massachusetts, though, have like, physicians I just think that there's a huge influence. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any physicians who are you seeing more physicians who are becoming more comfortable, more open talking about it?
Yes, absolutely.
Sure. Okay.
Well, definitely the ones I know, because I hit them over the head. But, the primary care doctors are more open to it because they see that their patients are using it, and they also like see that their patients are using it instead of opiates or instead of benzodiazepines. The oncologists are really cancer friendly, very cannabis friendly, because like 80% of their patients are using it and using it with good effect. I think the neurologists are becoming cannabis friendly because their patients are using it for migraine, for Parkinson's disease, for MS. So I think as more and more clinicians get exposed to these positive patient experiences, and as we get further away from like the monolithic cannabis is evil without medical uses, that whole propaganda they fed us in medical school, which was such nonsense, and as more of the exciting research that's being done gets sort of promulgated through the medical literature, and there's less of a, again, monolithic focus on harm and more of a focus, we still have to look at harm like we do with any medicine, but also a much more interesting focus on benefits. I think that heads are going to start to change. And it's interesting, even the like addiction psychiatrists who have made a killing on like treating cannabis addiction and with drug testing, and they've always been like so anti-cannabis, even they're starting to drift over. Now, whether they're doing it because they're enlightened and woke and they're good people and they believe in social justice, which is true for a lot of them, or whether they just don't want to be completely irrelevant because no one actually will talk to you if you're still in the 1950s, whatever the motivation or intention, they're even coming, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, they were like Reefer Madness Central. They just they've like blocked, they were against like every single marijuana and cannabis initiative for decades. It was awful. They had Robert DuPont as their head. He was a disaster about cannabis, and no wonder he made like millions on drug testing. But very recently, like within the last couple of weeks, they adopted their policy to be in favor of rescheduling it and not criminalizing people for it. So there's been evolution. So I think we're getting there slowly with the doctors. But as Upton Sinclair said, and this pertains to just a few doctors, but you can't change a man's mind when his income, earning an income depends on understanding the opposite. So there's definitely some there's a financial a prohibition. For example, law enforcement, it's going to be very hard to change their minds because they make such a killing on these bloated budgets, and it's such easy work like policing cannabis because there's no crime. So we're getting there, but we've got to change the conflict of interest if we want to really get people to understand.
What I think interesting though? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to throw in a little to back up what he's saying, is 536,000 cannabis arrests last year. More than, I think, another 60,000 less were violent crimes, and most of those cannabis convictions, again, were disproportionately against those most affected by the war on drugs. And the law enforcement's able to stereotype and profile just by looking at someone, and that has to stop. And I love Bruce Barcott from Leafly and how he explained why he changed from one way to the other, where he said this is not a drug issue anymore, this is a civil rights issue. And it has to change. It has to move forward. We are seeing it slowly. I do want to go back to drug versus drug for a second here. Penn State College of Medicine News put out something in August. They did a study on drug interaction with cannabis. And in particular, they were talking about antibiotics, antifungals versus heart medications, anticoagulants that prevent blood clots from forming. So they're concerned about the cannabis interaction with the Western medicine drugs that are out there. Do you have any evidence about this, or any stories, anecdotal stories, or even some research that you could cite about this?
Well, I'm more concerned about, I think CBD in particular does have the potential to interact with other medications, because CBD, exactly like grapefruit juice, inhibits the liver enzymes and can raise the level of certain drugs. So, this is very simple. Like if CBD is being metabolized by these particular liver enzymes, the other drugs aren't, and they could have higher levels because it takes the body longer to clear them because the liver is what cleans up your blood. So hypothetically, you can have higher levels of blood thinners, chemotherapeutic agents, anti-seizure agents, immunosuppressants. So you definitely want to tell your doctor if you're on CBD, and perhaps if you're on a blood thinner, check the levels a little bit more frequently. But I don't think there's been a single case study of anybody like having excessive bleeding due to being on CBD. Now, cannabis is more complicated. It has like 600 different molecules in it and like 140 different cannabinoids in it. And I just don't think they've been able to show, much as they tried, that any of this is clinically significant. Could you hypothetically have an interaction with an antibiotic? Sure. But then, so instead of getting 500 milligrams of amoxicillin, you're getting 499 milligrams of amoxicillin. That's not clinically significant.
Right.
So I think that, again, you always can get a news headline by writing anything anti-cannabis. But, some things are really important, like cannabis hyperemesis syndrome is real and important. It's sort of overdiagnosed now because it's like a trendy diagnosis. It was like underdiagnosed before because everybody was afraid to say they were on cannabis because they didn't want DSS to be called, or they didn't want to get in trouble with the police. But it is a real and important thing. But, you just have to take these things a little bit with a grain of salt because, in the same way, like people who are pro-cannabis, if it's anything that's negative about cannabis, they'll just reject it reflexively, which is a mistake because of course there are going to be things about it that are, you just want to be smart about it. Of course there are going to be things about it that are, you want to watch out for or be safe about. It's a psychoactive substance. In the same way, it's just, you can always get a headline if you write something against cannabis, but I just don't think that these drug interactions, again, with CBD, in these high doses, because you don't have super high CBD if you just use cannabis. But if you take 500 milligrams of CBD, that might affect your blood thinner. But I don't think cannabis by itself really has any really major drug interactions that we know of yet.
There you go. All right, I want to just throw a little theory out at you. When I first started this company, you mentioned that you want to say anything anti-cannabis and news jumps on it. Well, that's one of the reasons why I started Pro-Cannabis Media, because we're not going to do anti-cannabis. We're going to do pro-cannabis headlines here and that sort of thing. And that's what we're trying to do, is to give a voice to the industry. But I wrote a blog, and you mentioned DuPont, that the blog I wrote, one of the first ones, was in 1937, the wrong drug got prohibited.
Exactly.
And imagine if it was cannabis allowed to stay in as a medicine in the 30s, okay? And all of a sudden in 2016, the voters voted in adult use of alcohol. Imagine how challenging it would be to sell the public on the dangers of alcohol, especially versus a medicine that had been had been accepted for thousands of years, and I just wonder, I want to throw it back at you, would we have seen as much cancer, anxiety, Crohn's disease, all this stuff, would it have affected that over the last 50, 60 years if cannabis was still used and actually been able to have been researched and studied over the last 80 years?
Well, the answer to that question is we'll find out, because we're going to legalize it and we're going to study it and we're going to see what it can do. I mean, for example, with cancer, in cells, it has really remarkable anti-cancer activity, but that hasn't really been shown in humans yet, except with a couple cancers like glioblastoma multiforme as an adjunctive treatment, not as a primary treatment. So the answer is we'll see. Certainly symptomatically, people would be a lot better. The thing is, we just have to figure out how much cannabis affects the pathology of the diseases versus the symptoms of the disease. It's remarkably effective at treating the symptoms of the disease. And if the disease is something like fibromyalgia, which is mostly symptoms, then you are treating the pathology of the disease. But if it's something like Crohn's disease, they do these studies in Israel where, like a huge percentage of people feel better and don't need steroids anymore and go off a lot of their medications. But then they study the pathology under a microscope and there isn't any change. So it's just really amazing how it affects diseases in some ways, but doesn't necessarily affect the underlying biology of the disease. But then with the pervasiveness of the endocannabinoid system, we probably can affect the underlying biology once we understand it better and develop medications based on this system. A whole system that controls everything has been ignored for 80 years. So the answer is, I'd say probably, and we'll see.
That's great. And more importantly, I love your enthusiasm and your positive outlook. Terrific talking with you, Dr. Peter Grinspoon. How can people find you? I think you're pretty easy to find on the internet, because I did. PeterGrinspoon.com.
And you're seeing healthcare professionals, people who are interested in getting a medical card, can do a teleconsult with you, or
teleconsult, or anybody who wants to consult on cannabis. In Massachusetts, I can do certifications, but I consult with people all over the place. And I can do health and wellness coaching over telemedicine with anybody.
There you go. All right. Well, Dr. Peter Grinspoon, thank you so much for joining us. It's been my pleasure. And I look forward to hopefully one day actually seeing you in person and shaking your hand. How's that?
Look forward to it. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. And Alyssa, nice to see you as well.
You look the same 20 years later. I still enjoy seeing you. And it's,
get coffee one of these days.
Absolutely.
Social distance coffee. How about that?
Social distance coffee. That's what we're going to do with this 10-foot straw. And we're going to, anyway, that's the deal. All right, Dr. Peter Grinspoon, thank you
guys.
so much.
Have a good night.
Yep,
Bye.
It's a whole new world of weed out there, isn't it? Everyone is learning new ways to titrate, ingest, consume, imbibe, and engage with this plant medicine we call cannabis. Hi, I'm Jimmy Young, the founder of Pro Cannabis Media and the host of In the Weeds, and once in a while, the really live business cannabis talk show we call Green Rush on Friday afternoons from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern. I've been a medical patient in Massachusetts for almost 10 years now. I remember my first trip to a dispensary just outside of Boston, and I told the bud tender I didn't want to smoke it anymore. So I tried edibles, then tinctures, then vaping, and now if I'm going to smoke, I only use the Weedgets filtration system. What? The Weedgets.com, Weedgets, that's weed, W-E-E-D, G-E-T-S.com, is where you'll find the planet's coolest product.
Both cool the smoke from 1300 degrees to just 90 into your lungs. Plus, the maze pipe and pre-roll filters get rid of all the gunk that you just don't want in your lungs if you can help it.
Add in the code of PCMTV and you get 15% off. So just go to Weejits.com and check out the best way to enjoy a cooler smoke with less coughing and hacking and more peace of mind. All that resin and tar is collected in the polyurethane filters that are easy to clean with soap, water, and a few Q-tips. Your lungs will thank you, and so will I.
We are a cultivation through to consumption lifestyle brand for the cannabis industry. Of course, the crown jewel in our product line is the Armoire home grow system. So now with Green Goddess Supply, we can take you everywhere from growing it in the Armoire right through to storing it, consuming it, rolling it, storing it, you name it, A to Z. Our goal is to enable everybody and anybody anywhere to be able to produce their own organic flower quickly, easily, discreetly, and inexpensively.
You would think that it is. However, there's quite a bit of debate right now in the accounting industry when it relates to cannabis with this exact question. I'm part of a few different networking groups that are solely accountants for cannabis companies. And there's been quite a bit of back and forth in those communities and discussion regarding whether 280E, if it went away, if the administration legalized cannabis or took it off of Schedule 1, what would happen? And it could go either way right now. The debate is it could make the accountant's life much easier. That's what a lot of the inexperienced accountants are saying right now, it seems, whereas the accountants that have been in this industry for a while and have gone through the same thing that happened with hemp a few years ago are saying that it actually will make lives more difficult, because when hemp became declassified a while back, the accounting became more complicated.
Safetiva Labs in Westfield is fast becoming the #1 testing lab for cannabis in Western Massachusetts. Safetiva understands the importance for accurate on-time test results for your product. That's why their current compliance panel turnaround time is less than 2 days. That's Safetiva Labs in Westfield. For more information, go to safetiva.com. Bay State Cannabis Report is supported by Holyoke Cannabis, Holyoke's finest cannabis recreational experience. The Vermont Cannabis Report is supported by another Green Mountain business, Cannatrol, winner of High Times Best Dry Cure System. Check them out at cannatrolls.com.